civil rights supporters from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington. The speech was a defining moment of the American Civil Rights Movement. Beginning with a reference to the Emancipation Proclamation, King observes that 100 years later and the Negro is still not free. Toward the end of the speech, King departed from his prepared text for a partly improvised speech on the theme, "I Have a Dream," prompted by Mahalia Jackson's cry, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." This most excited the crowd. King describes his dreams of freedom and equality arising from a land of slavery and hatred. John Meckham writes that, with a single phrase, Martin Luther King Jr. joined Jefferson and Lincoln in the ranks of men who shaped modern America. The speech was ranked the top American speech for the 20th century. Before giving his I Have a Dream speech, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the mechanicals of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. He said, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were singing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was promised that all men, yes, black as well as white, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring that sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which comes back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of the opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the dark sands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. But there is something that he wanted to say to his people. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. When we must allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. And again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The Negro community must not lead to distrust of all white people, for many of our white brothers have come to realize that their destiny is tied with our destiny, and they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom, and we cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. So continue the work with the faith that unearned suffering. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. Finally, before his speech, he said, and so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Without further ado, please applaud Brothers Jalen and Chase as they give their very own rendition of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.